Doc Storm annual lecture here. My name is Bob Mason. I'm a professor in the Department of Integrative Biology, and I had the great honor and privilege of knowing both Doc, as we call him, and Bill Lovejoy, the man who and the alumnus that funded this lecture series. So unfortunately, gonna have to bear with me a little bit, and I'm gonna talk about, oops, I guess I should I be up here, Ricardo? Yeah, okay. We're getting a little reverberation. I'll probably put this down. All right. So there is Robert M. Doc Storm, known as Doc to most everyone. Professor Robert McLeod Storm, born in 1918, passed away in 2017, spent over 6 decades conducting research and teaching in our department, then called the Zoology Department. Considered by many to be the preeminent scientist on Western reptiles and amphibians, Doc Storm was broadly trained and was also a respected authority on much of the Pacific Northwest vertebrate fauna. He spent a great deal of time in the field, much of that time with students. His impact is impressive and includes dozens of student co-authored publications and the mentorship of more than 70 graduate students. Doc Storm was born in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, before the family moved briefly to Portland and shortly thereafter to Illinois, where he was raised and went to college. He arrived in Corvallis in 1939 to pursue his master's degree in zoology and never left except for service in World War II. Now listen to this carefully, especially you young people. The title Doc is a term of endearment and respect. It's not an official title like a distinguished professor. You can only earn that by the respect of your students. Okay, it's a term of endearment and respect, not for Storm's academic degree, but for his service as a medic on the beaches of Normandy. His battalion was among the first wave to land on Omaha Beach during the D-Day invasion on June 6th of 1944. Surrounded by steep cliffs and heavily defended, Omaha Beach was the bloodiest of the D-Day beaches, with roughly 2,400 U.S. troops turning up dead, wounded, or missing. Storm was later awarded the Bronze Star for courage under fire while tending to the wounded. From that time on, virtually everyone called him by that name, Doc, including his wife, who's here with us today. So if you're wondering about that, and if you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, and so those beginning scenes, that's what that hellish stuff, that's what Doc lived through without a rifle, as I remember him telling me once. Okay, after the war, Storm returned to OSU in 1946 to complete his PhD with Professor Kenneth L. Gordon, and was hired in 1948 as an instructor and later tenured professor in the Department of Zoology. Renowned for his pioneering research in herpetology, Doc produced nearly 50 scientific publications and several field guides on herpetology. But his most important and cherished contribution is the many students he mentored during his 36 years as an OSU professor. Doc influenced generations of biologists whose theses and dissertations deal with nearly every group of vertebrates. Famous for his open door policy and always being available to talk with students, Doc advised 71 grad students, including 37 who completed their PhD. Those students produced at least another 50 doctorates, most of them herpetologists who made profound and important contributions to the field. Doc was also a champion for undergraduate education at OSU, winning the College of Sciences Carter Award in 1974. For outstanding and inspirational undergraduate teaching, and served as head advisor in the zoology department for years. Doc retired in 1984, but remained active as an emeritus professor of zoology, still taking many field trips to Eastern Oregon with students who loved and admired him. Doc passed away at the age of 99 in 2017. So that's the man we're honoring. Okay, the next man. Bill Lovejoy, pictured here. Bill Lovejoy was born in a small Ohio town with fewer than 1,000 people. He came from 4 generations of coal miners, so by all accounts, he should have been a coal miner, but instead he became a first-generation college graduate in 1951. After serving in the Navy, Bill earned a master's degree in geology before arriving at OSU to work on his PhD with Doc Storm. He studied mountain beavers, or boomers. John, what else do we call those things? Okay, Aplodontia, which are not even beavers at all. which is they're kind of an interesting critter. That's what he's holding there in his left hand there. Let's see, he earned his PhD in 1972 and then spent the rest of his academic career at Georgia Southern University, where he influenced generations of students with his teaching and research as a professor of biology. Quote, Doc had a rapport with students both in and out of the classroom that I tried to emulate in my teaching career, said Lovejoy. Lovejoy is one of the students who was inspired and mentored by Doc Storm, describing him as a considerate, thoughtful advisor with strong friendships and connections to many former students and colleagues. Quote, Doc built a strong community. He was easy to get to know, easy to work with, and well-liked, recalled Lovejoy. Inspired by his mentor in 2016, Bill Lovejoy established the Robert M. Storm Distinguished Lecture in Integrative Biology, an endowed series to promote excellence, advancement, and inspiration in biology, particularly vertebrate biology, to the OSU and Corvallis communities. And you're the evidence of this tonight. Quote, by establishing this lecture series at Oregon State University, I hope such inspiration will continue to motivate students for years to come. We are so grateful for Bill's generous gift in honor of his beloved mentor, Doc Storm. And then Bill passed away in 2022 at the age of 95. So you can see there's a pattern forming here. These guys live a long time. All right. And so now, let me get, how do we get to Dan's slide? Oh, look at that. This is slick. Jeez, I'd like to take credit for that. All right. It is, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce tonight's Doc Storm lecturer, Dan Blumstein. Dan fits exactly in the mold of what Doc was talking about, and you'll see in a bit here, talking about long-term research, studying a focal model species, although it's hard to limit him to that. Okay, Dan got his bachelor's at the University of Colorado Boulder in environmental biology and environmental conservation, and then his master's and PhD at the University of California, Davis. And Dan is now currently is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UCLA, and he's in the Institute of the Environment and of the Environment and Sustainability there at UCLA. Between 2009, 2016, he had the pleasure of chairing the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing there. He also co-directs the UCLA Evolutionary Medicine Program. He served as the editor of the journal Animal Behavior, the flagship journal in the field of animal behavior from 2016 to 2009, and has been the editor of Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health since 2011. He is an elected fellow of the Animal Behavior Society. Dan is broadly interested in the evolution of behavior and conservation biology and the integration of behavior into other disciplines. And I'm sure he's going to be saying, although I don't know what he's going to tonight, but I'm sure he's going to talk about marmots make an ideal experimental system to ask questions about the evolution of social behavior and communication because they live in a variety of habitats, exhibit a range of social systems, and all species emit between 1 and 5 types of alarm calls. Past studies have focused on the meaning of these calls. Current work focuses on the yellow-bellied marmots at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, Rumble, in Colorado, of which Dan is the director, president of the board, right, of the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, very well-known, long-serving ecological field station. Okay, let's see, the behavior and population biology of the marmots of Rumble have been continuously studied since 1962, starting with the work of Ken Armitage. Dan's long-term research at Rumble provides a great model for studies on longevity. Actually, I went crazy in here because you'll see he covers so many things on longevity, epigenetic aging, hibernation, behavioral conservation. New research directions focus on the consequences of social relationships and the importance of stress in reproduction, health, and longevity. Okay, grad students in the audience. Dan is widely published with 8 books and over 400 publications. His H index as of this morning is 98. His I-10 index is 396, And he has been cited as of this morning, Dan, you're probably not up to it, 36,421 times. So for those of you who are not in our field, those are big numbers. Okay. So with that, Dan, welcome. And thank you for.
Thank you for that. I am not talking about marmots today. I will talk about marmots tomorrow. I'm going to talk about all sorts of other things today. So I'd like you to put on your seatbelts. I am so impressed that, towards the end of the quarter, people are coming out on a Monday night. So thank you. Thank you for being here. And I hope you won't be disappointed and learn something, and we can, argue about stuff later on, because, talking about things and debating them is how we learn in science. And today what I really want to do is talk about non-marmot work. I study lots of things. Giant clams are my favorite species, but I'm not really talking about giant clams. But really thinking about how one integrates different disciplines. And here I want to think about understanding behavioral biology and the implications of this for conservation science broadly. So we're creating a ghastly future, any way you look at it. Here we go. Earth's surface is, human altered, damaged, lost. Our oceans are modified by humans. Kelp forests, which are important, really important, systems are disappearing. Seagrass meadows are disappearing. Large predatory fish, they taste good. You should not taste good in this world. Live coral cover is going away. I mean, what is it? The fourth consecutive bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef. Wetlands, there are no wetlands. And I'll talk about some in Southern California, but there are no wetlands, et cetera. And any way you look at this, this is a problem. So really, no matter what the geoscientists say, I'm sorry if anyone's a geoscience, we are living in the Anthropocene. And in the Anthropocene, our interactions with wildlife are increasing. And we try to connect to wildlife often through ecotourism, which, if you sort of adopt a strict definition, it's a travel to fragile and pristine and usually protected areas that strives to be low impact and often small scale. Ecotourism, as opposed to natural area tourism in general, tries to help educate the traveler, provides funds for conservation, directly benefits the economic development and political empowerment of local communities, and fosters respect for different cultures and for human rights. Now, that's sort of an impossible triad to achieve. And as a behavioral biologist, I mean, you can kind of trade off two things, but how do you trade off three things and optimize something? And, it creates all sorts of challenges. So for example, we know that we are loving penguins to death, that if we're ecotourists, we go in and we disturb penguins, and this has implications for their energy reserves and increases mortality. It decreases chick survival simply by going to penguin colonies. I'm not saying we shouldn't be going to penguin colonies, but how do we go to penguin colonies better? Urbanization modifies wildlife-human interactions. This is P22, our Los Angeles mountain lion who recently passed away. But at the end of the day, we have mountain lions in Los Angeles. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a really impressive thing, but how do we continue to have mountain lions in Los Angeles? Turns out some of our work has shown that Los Angeles mountain lions become more nocturnal as human activity increases. So, we're influencing their behavior. Other people have shown that that there's variation in how species respond to humans. So as a behavioral biologist, as a human, you know that you all have different personalities. If you have a dog, you know that animals have different personalities as well. Well, lots of animals behave different ways. So it's not simply that human impacts have one uniform response to various animals. They have different responses, different effects. And to understand that, we need to really begin studying lots of species and developing theories to understand how we think about those. We looked at mountain lions after a mega fire in California, in Los Angeles, and it turns out that after the fire, the proportion of day activity was greater after the fire than before the fire. The road crossings increased after a fire compared to before a fire. Those two things alone are increasing interactions of humans with mountain lions, which is a bad thing. All of our mountain lions get killed by cars, unless they get burned up, which was kind of sad. The the probability of being in an urban area increased. And it turns out also younger males were moving around more and interacting with others, and lions kill younger males if they interact with them. So, fires, which are becoming increasingly important and common, are influencing animal behavior, particularly charismatic animals. If you look at European birds, I'm going to talk about flight initiation distance, FID, a lot later on. But flight initiation distance is how close you can get to something before it moves away. European birds that tolerate humans, you can get closer to them, the relative population trend was higher than those that are less tolerant of humans. So there are relationships between behavior and population persistence or species persistence in areas, or population trends. Urbanization modifies human-wildlife interactions. You got to walk your dog carefully, when you're walking through LA. On our group chat on my street, and I just, live 5.5 miles from the UCLA campus. There was a coyote on our block in front of our neighbor's house this morning. So a lot of us have dogs and we walk our dogs. So we have to change things. But that sort of really emphasizes the point that when we think about humans and wildlife, we can't really divorce the two. We can't treat them separately. We have to really begin thinking about them together. And a lot of people have recognized this and think about human and animals are linked in a socio-ecological system. So with Kat Hernandez, one of my graduate students, we're thinking, so she's in an interdisciplinary PhD program, and the goal is to have two very different advisors. And it turns out Kat is a science fiction writer in addition to being a biologist and now social scientist. And we sort of came up with this idea that we create narratives. We create narratives to explain how we interact with animals. Animals, these narratives influence policy and how we manage animals. That influences how we interact with them. That influences how animals are responding. Animals behave in response to this by moving and interacting, with us or not. And that changes our perception. So we have this virtuous sort of human and animal behavior linked in this socio-ecological system. So beginning to, this sort of emphasizes the need and the importance of not divorcing these two things. Now, it turns out behavior plays a really important role in understanding and managing human-wildlife interactions. So my friend and colleague Oded Berger-Tal a number of years ago pointed out that we can think about anthropogenic impacts on animal behavior. More animals are being killed by cars, for example. As we build roads, they're crossing roads more and getting hit. We can think about behavior-based management. We can think about manipulating behavior to manage wildlife-human interactions, conflicts potentially, or what we perceive as conflicts. Or we can think about behavior as being an indicator of population stability or what animals are doing, et cetera. So I'm going to sort of adopt this sort of framework and begin thinking about animal behavior, but I'm going to focus on anti-predator behavior. Why anti-predator behavior? What is anti-predator behavior? Well, first, it's the thing animals do to reduce the probability of being detected by a predator, attacked by a predator, or killed by a predator. I guess there are some marmots here. There's a marmot alarm calling it a fox and a baby marmot in the fox's mouth. So this includes a series of adaptations to detect predators, to identify them, anti-predator vigilance, for example, escape from predators, flee them, use refugia, and communicate about them. And I've studied all these sorts of things in all sorts of different animals. So why should we study anti-predator behavior? Well, there are direct effects of predation on populations and communities. Predators kill animals and reduce population size. Predation is a really strong selective force that influences where animals go. Turns out that in our long-term study of marmots, we can follow populations of marmots or subpopulations of marmots that have been persistent for now 63 years, or have gone intermittently extinct. And when we sort of did a cross-sectional analysis of fear versus food as predictors of this, we found that variation in food does not explain where they persist or go extinct, but rather variation in vigilance and big boulders and rocky substrate, which protects them from being excavated by nasty things like bears and badgers, does. So it's predation that can influence population persistence. There are indirect effects of predation risk on populations and communities. I heard Liana Zanette was here a little while ago and for a departmental talk, and she sort of is a pioneer in showing the sound of predators can scare animals away from using certain habitats. Fear may structure communities. And predation often is the cause of wildlife management failure. And one thing that I was involved in early on, and as I continue to be involved in, is reintroductions, reintroducing animals from captivity to the wild to recover populations, or translocating animals from one location to another to recover populations. And most of these fail. And that's both a waste of money, and it's also an ethical issue, because the failure means the animals died, and a lot of money went into that. So how can we, and predation is often implicated in this, so how can we improve our game? So I'm going to define translational wildlife research, sort of modeling this off the NIH's from the bench to the bedside. You know, biomedical research they talk about that has a clear human health benefit. Research, translational research more generally, is I think research takes fundamental insights, in this case from behavioral biology, and ultimately applies them to wildlife management and conservation. When I say conservation, I'm implicitly assuming and implying that we perceive we have too few of something and we want more of them. When I say wildlife management, I'm sort of implicitly implying that we perceive we have too many of something and we want to get rid of them. And those are sort of two sides on the coin of, you know, managing human-wildlife interactions or managing wildlife populations. And I think a theme of this are mechanistic studies, understanding how animals think and work mechanistically that will allow us to predict how animals are going to respond to humans and other sorts of anthropogenic effects. Now, I'm going to be talking about lots of ideas here. I haven't gotten started yet. And I think it's really important to put this in the perspective of many of us are scientists here, and evidence-based conservation and management is essential. We need to evaluate actively through designing experiments whether something helps solve a particular problem that you have, or we need to engage in passive adaptive management. So view everything I'm saying as a potential hypothesis ripe for exploration. In some cases, we're evaluating them. In other cases, we're not. But it might stimulate ideas for those who want to apply things. And the take-home message is, well, does it work or not? And we need to build in the evaluation in studies for this. So with that preamble, I'm going to introduce what I call cognitive-based management. I'm going to talk a lot about flight initiation distance, which is a metric to quantify disturbance, and sort of two broad areas I'm interested in: the evolutionary ecology of fear. Why do animals not tolerate people? How can we understand which ones do and which ones don't? Put a hiking trail into an area and you lose some species. Why? Which ones? How do we think about that? And I want to think about the natural history of habituation-like processes, and I'll propose something I call the contiguous habitat hypothesis. I also want to talk about eco-evolutionary models. What happens when species lose their predators or gain novel ones? What happens when you move to suburbia from the dangerous inner city? How long do you keep locking your doors and keeping your lights on at night outside? And I want to talk about a really exciting project in Australia. I'll end with a really exciting project in Australia where we've tried to train prey that were driven extinct locally, well, on the continent, by introduced predators to live with those predators, and how we can then, that can potentially allow coexistence. Let's talk about cognition. Sarah Shuttleworth, brilliant cognitive biologist, defined cognition broadly as processes including perception, learning, memory, and decision-making. In short, all the ways in which animals take in information about the world through the senses, process, retain, and decide to act on them. So I'm sort of adopting this Shuttleworth definition, which is very expansive. Why does cognition matter? Well, wildlife crossings only work if animals are attracted to them. How do we know if they're attracted to them? That's a cognitive question. This is a mock-up of the world's largest wildlife crossing that is being constructed today in Los Angeles to connect areas and keep mountain lions connected with other populations. They're having all sorts of genetic problems because they find themselves in the Santa Monica Mountains outside LA, and they are isolated from others, and their tails are messed up, and they're having other problems. So there's inbreeding issues because the population is isolated. This is one of the strategies to reduce that. Crop foraging is a really big problem. Animals come onto crops and they eat food that people are growing, and this is perceived as a problem, and it's really a problem if your livelihood depends on it. And how do we repel animals? And these can range from monkeys to birds to elephants. I mean, how do you repel an elephant? Bees. So they don't like bees. So cognitive-based management is sort of how my friends and I are sort of thinking about this. And this emerged from a couple days brainstorming and writing with Oded Bergertal and Alison Greger, good friends, good colleagues. And we were asked to write something for Annual Review of Ecology, Evolution, and Systematics about conservation and behavior. And we're like, we've written everything we can write. What new can we write? And I'm like, at some level, it really is all about attraction or repulsion. And then we started riffing off that. And in a couple days, we sort of whipped up this outline of how to think about this. So this focuses on decisions animals make about approaching or avoiding specific features or resources. And we think it provides a mechanistic understanding of maybe some conservation successes and failures. So a failure, for example, is culling badgers in the UK because they have tuberculosis, or possums in New Zealand, which were introduced to New Zealand but have bovine TB as well. And that didn't reduce TB. Why? Because other possums or badgers were attracted to vacant territories and came in and occupied them. So we need to understand something about perception to understand this. It may explain why certain manipulations create ecological and evolutionary traps. So people were planting trees in the southern Negev desert where the endangered Bershiva fringe-fingered lizard lived. Well, shrikes were attracted to these trees and they started eating the lizards. Not a good thing if you're trying to have trees in an area, but also not a good thing if you're trying to recover an endangered species. So thinking about how animals perceive their habitat mechanistically, what attracts them or repels them is important. And we suggest that many wildlife management questions can be framed as attract and repel questions. So we might want to repel animals from garbage or cities. We might want to repel them from wind farms. I mean, a lot of bats are killed in wind turbines. We might want to repel them from solar panels. A lot of birds are killed on solar panels. We might hope they ignore us, if we're engaged in ecotourism or natural area recreation. And we might want to attract them to wildlife crossings or good habitat. We might want to keep wolves in Yellowstone where they're not going to be shot rather than have them go outside Yellowstone where they are going to be shot. So one of the things we thought a lot about is if you ask a conservation manager, what do you need? They want decision support tools. What's a decision support tool? Decision support tool is, in many cases, it could be viewed as a sort of a bifurcating decision tree that helps people make decisions about what should I do in this if I'm in this particular context. So, at the highest level, is there a clear need to attract or repel animals? Are scarecrows and hazing effective? Yes, great. If they're not, maybe you have to consider cognitive-based management. Is habitat modification? Yeah, great. If no, maybe consider cognitive-based management. Is lethal control effective and acceptable? Yes. Are you sure? Okay, no, consider cognitive-based management. Maybe other conservation failures can be interpreted through an approach withdrawal thing. So I'm not going to talk about, so there are rules of attraction and repulsion that we sort of generated and discuss in this paper. One is that with respect to perception and attention, the Umwelt, the cognitive world of animals, what they're able to perceive matters. And you need to think about this. I mean, it's sort of obvious. If animals don't hear something and you're trying to repel them with a sound, maybe that doesn't work so well. But attention is finite. If I'm talking here and someone starts taking their clothes off next to me, you're going to have a harder time paying attention to me because attention is something that's limited and can be focused, and it can be distracted by all sorts of things, even in different modalities. So attention is something you need to think about, and you can manipulate that in various ways to make an area less attractive in some cases, or make an area more attractive. Decision making. Decisions, as a behavioral ecologist, I view decisions as economic. So you need to think about the costs and the benefits of making a decision. Not all cues are going to be equally valued for decisions. Some may be more important than others. And if you're having problems attracting and repelling animals, maybe that's because you don't understand the value of various cues. A lot associated with learning. Learning is Bayesian. It matters what experiences you had before. Learning may be biased and to focus on certain information. The order of cues and experiences may matter. sensitive periods may matter, learning things at certain times, or you may only be able to learn things at certain times. You have to be explicit about what you're teaching. Sometimes we teach the wrong thing when we're trying to train animals to do things. Stimuli should be reinforced. Social learning can be an accelerant. Good local example, the Columbia River, the dams in the Columbia River, but 230 something kilometers upriver. When the first sea lions discovered that, California sea lions, they would go back and they'd have fish breath and they would be fat and they would haul out with their buddies at the opening of the river. And it turns out you can model like that, like disease transmission, because the buddies they hang out with who smelled the fish breath and saw obesity said there's something good up the river, and they went upriver. And I've been involved in studies trying to understand how to repel the sea lions, and it just doesn't really work. This is a supernormal stimulus, and unfortunately, because we destroyed the habitat, it's home to 13 endangered salmonids. I mean, this is a nightmare. And I said, don't let the first Steller sea lion get up there. Well, the Stellers are up there now, and it's a real problem because they are endangered right now. We recovered the California sea lions, and they eat even more because they're ginormous. So, social learning can be an accelerant, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending upon what you're trying to do. Memory. Animals are more likely to remember survival-related information. So these are sort of the rules of attraction and repulsion. And we sort of put this into a decision support tool, and you can read the paper if you want to get into that. But for example, if you're trying to attract something, can the animals perceive the desired attractant? Yeah, great. No, target the Umwelt. Change the perceptual, understand the perceptual world of animals until they can perceive the attractant or whatever. Do they attend to that? Are they distracted? Increase the intensity, turn up the volume, provide more food, do whatever, or remove the distraction or interference. And you can sort of go down this in a sort of a checklist fashion and diagnose problems. When I first gave this talk, I was giving it in Canada, and a woman who is the director of the largest urban park in Canada outside Ottawa basically said, oh my God, I have such raccoon problems and I wish I had this years ago. So this is what managers are looking for. And for the students interested in integrating conservation, trying to sort of figure out how to create decision support tools is really important and really hard. And it's a really fun intellectual challenge. So I think this is going to be useful and is useful for some people. I'm going to switch angles a bit, and I'm going to talk about humans change animals' behavior. And a key to understanding one way that humans impact animals is that they often view people as predators. So if predators approach something, at some point, the animal will look up and fly away. And we can sort of quantify this in a more analytical way by calculating flight initiation distance. And alert distances when they look, and some starting distances when you start, and flight initiation distances when they flee from you. So this insight, sort of using flight initiation distance, sort of when I was thinking about how we can, why do only some people tolerate disturbance? Why do only some species tolerate human disturbance or activities? I figured flight initiation distance could be one way to get some traction on this. This is an Australian pelican. It's the size of a small airplane. It's my wife behind the Australian pelican, and they're pretty tolerant of people in some places, which is kind of cool. So as I said, FID is a method to quantify perception of risk, and I think it can be used for wildlife management questions in a number of ways. First, we can gain insights into how animals are perceiving us, but also we can design setback zones, distances we need to be away from animals to minimize our disturbance on them. So I went out and developed a comparative data set with about 10,000 flushes and over 300 species of birds. When people say, what do? I scare things. This is fun. Turns out that ornithology, a lot of ornithologists around the world figured out this was fun. And I'll tell you what we're up to now. But it's, it's an interesting way to ask both, conceptually interesting questions, but also applied questions. So early on, I discovered that larger birds detect approaching humans at a greater distance. And at the time I was working in Australia, so I really did have emus. You have to be careful with emus because emus come towards you. And I would call that a negative flight initiation distance. And since ratites will kill you, I would go the other direction. Turns out also that larger birds flush at greater distances. So Ted Sankiewicz, at the time a grad student at Davis, and I he's like, oh, I'm really thinking about a review. I'm like, hey, we should do a formal meta-analysis of this. He's like, what's that? I'm like, let's do a meta-analysis. So meta-analyses, for those of you who don't know what they are formally, you do a formal, logical, systematic review and document everything you're doing. And you're ultimately trying to estimate the effect size of something. So, and you do so by creating basically weighted average effect sizes from a series of different papers. What's interesting is modern meta-analyses can handle phylogenetic relationships, and they also have what are really useful, which are these heterogeneity statistics. So overall, you might find there's no effect of something on something, but if you look at this group of animals, you see it, and another group of animals, you don't. Or if it's studied one way, you see it, and if it's studied another way, you don't see it. So the whole process of doing a formal meta-analysis and calculating some of these statistics can be really useful in trying to understand what's going on around you. In a book I was co-editing a number of years ago, we asked Anders Moller to do a meta-analysis of FID in birds. And I'm reporting the R values here are correlation coefficients, which is one measure of effect size. The closer to 1 it is, the bigger the effect. So FID decreases with urbanization. For many species, if they can coexist with humans, you can get closer to them in urban areas. It increases with body mass. Bigger species you often can get closer to. It varies with predation risk. In higher predation risk areas, you can't get closer to animals. It decreases with increasing latitude. It turns out there's latitudinal variation in flight initiation distance, which is super interesting. Decreases with sociality. It decreases with parasitism. Sick animals, let you get close to them. If you're feverish, you're letting things get close to you too. You're not escaping. Increases with hunting. And that can be very seasonal, so it can change literally after the first shot's fired. And there's a bunch of life history and habitat openness effects. If you look at meta-analyses we've done in other taxa, turns out environmental, life history, and natural history traits influence escape. And consistently in all these different taxa, body size explains a lot of the variation. So there's something with body size. In general, animals generally flush early and avoid the rush. So I sort of came up with this idea of flush early and avoid the rush, and I'm sort of laughing at this and wrote this up as sort of a rule of behavior, because we don't have lots of rules in behavior. Everything's so variable. But typically, if you start walking towards something at a greater distance, it will flush at a greater distance. And this guy, Diogo Samia, wrote me, and he was a graduate student in Brazil, and in sort of bad English is like, I'm testing, this hypothesis, and I'm like really busy. And he's like, please send me all of your data. And I'm like, oh my God. And I'm like, okay, whatever. You're supposed to share data, so I share data. We can talk about data sharing, and the Marmot stuff I'm a little more controlled over because a lot of people are working on it actively. But here I'm like, supposed to share data, so I send him everything. Then a couple months later, I'm in the field, and he's like, I have results. Please read. And I'm like, this guy's like a young buck. He's going to like trash me. I'm supposed to read this, and I'm too busy. He's like, please read. So I read it, and I'm like, okay, this is the best, strongest test of Blumstein's idea. Turns out that it works. I'm like, oh. And it's like, this is the strongest test of Blumstein's idea, and he's like, you be co-author. I'm like, talk to your major professor. I mean, I gave him all the data, but aside from that, and I said, here's what needs to be done. You need to do this analysis and that analysis. Think about this, think about that. And he did those, and I ended up rewriting the whole thing. And that was the first of like 18 papers we wrote together. So it was a good ending. And he ended up winning for his work as a graduate student, like the best ecologist PhD in Brazil one year. So, moral of story, share your data with bright people. But if animals generally flush early and avoid the rush, when you think about setback distances, they should probably be big. But we do see animals tolerating humans, and we particularly see some big animals tolerating humans. So Diogo and I sort of came up with an idea of thinking about, well, some studies look at FID of the same species in different areas, and we call those contrasts. So it could be in nature versus urban, and this is how they describe them. It could be in rural versus urban. It could be rural versus suburban. It could be within urbanized areas, but different places. It could be on islands versus mainlands, right? So we summarized all the data out there, did a systematic review and meta-analysis, and created what we call the contrasts. And it turns out rural versus urban was the biggest effect size. Tolerance is an economic decision, just as FID is an economic decision. And the type of contrast has the largest effect on it. Turns out the second largest effect is body size. Bigger bodied species are slightly more tolerant, significantly, but slightly more tolerant than smaller bodied species. So let's revisit this idea that you have to be careful about big species. So, I mean, there's a number of implications from this. First, it stimulated a lot of other studies that used FID to study life history, trade-offs and risk-taking, from a conceptual background. Second, large animals, birds, may be initially vulnerable to human disturbance, but those that are able to tolerate people, actually large ones might be, more tolerant. If we look at an individual-based model where we make assumptions about what happens if you're disturbed, large birds, which are more easily disturbed, have lower expected fitness than smaller birds, but the large species that can coexist with humans, they tolerate them. And I think future research needs to parameterize these sorts of models with real data and apply them to real problems. And what it really says is we have another question, because good research leads to more questions than it does answers after all. What allows that first filter to happen? What allows species to coexist with humans in the first place? So I said that people sort of went gonzo over this. Peter Mikula was a Fulbright fellow in my lab, and he's like, I want to work towards creating a database of all the published FID data. And we're up to about 168,000 flushes on about 25% of the birds on Earth, which is pretty cool. We have there are flushes on Antarctic birds, but the people who've collected the data refuse to share them. So we don't have data on Antarctic birds. You have to go do that. This also got me into thinking about the natural history of habituation-like processes, because tolerance can come about various ways. And one of those is that if you're not that threatening, animals may learn quickly to not avoid you. So habituation is defined as a decline in responsiveness to a stimulus with repeated exposure. And typically these are non-threatening stimuli, but not all animals habituate. Sometimes they sensitize. Sensitization is an increase in responsiveness to a stimulus with repeated exposure. So our dog has habituated to the fact that we say stop barking when he's asking for food at the dinner table, but the blue angels strafing the beach on Fleet Week in San Francisco sensitized him to going to the beach, which was very sad. So while we have known, and psychologists have studied these processes for over a century, we don't really have a natural history of this. We don't really understand the evolutionary ecology of it. We don't understand the conditions under which animals habituate or sensitize. So some colleagues and I, led by Catherine, who was at the time a master's student in Denis Real's lab, worked on creating a framework for studying behavioral tolerance. And there's some interesting insights from there. And it's important because, again, habituation-like processes are one of several mechanisms. And it matters because when you look at things like associative learning, where animals get rewarded for something, habituation is a non-reward-based learning. But when you look at associative learning, the rules of associative learning. Habituation is supposed to be easy to reverse. Associative learning is supposed to be harder to reverse. So the mechanism leading to this tolerance really matters. And that's sort of the main take-home message from this particular review. So I started talking about ecotourism, and this is something that I've been thinking about much of my career. And naively, people might say that when you get more and more ecotourists in an area and animals habituate or become tolerant of humans, that makes them more exposed to predators, real predators. Now that's a really interesting cognitive question, it turns out, because it's sort of, the assumption is that by habituating to a human, maybe animals won't respond to wolves. Well, not one, wolves might be much more risky than a hiker. Two, I look very different than a wolf looks. And there's this idea of transferring habituation, which is used to study in human childhood development studies, how pre-verbal humans classify things. So at some level, when you say that by habituating or becoming tolerant to humans, you're more vulnerable to other things, at some level, you're assuming that the animals classify a human and another predator in the same category. So we worked with Dictix. I teach a field biology course. We work all over the world. I do this every other year. Set it up as a bunch of student projects, make the students work in groups of randomly assigned groups of 3. And we go out and we do science. I mean, we have great students at UCLA. They are great consumers of knowledge. My goal is to make them producers of knowledge. I've published over 200 articles with undergraduates. And a lot of them have come from this field course. So we're out in Kenya, we're driving around, we're looking at Dictix. Dictix are these little monogamous ungulates, that sit together and quiver because they fall prey to 36 species of things, birds and mammals, and they just shake when you look at them. Now, it turns out many species respond to the sound of their predators, and they take evasive action. And we did 2 studies on Dictix, and Dictix are smart. If you play back, they have a prehensile nose that sort of twitches and moves around. It's really cute. But if you play back the sound of a raptor, they look up. If you play back the sound of a jackal, a terrestrial predator like a coyote, they look around and they start sniffing. So, Dictix are smart. So we broadcast jackal calls and birdsong within half a kilometer of humans and farther away from human habitations. And we looked at the Impala field station as one of these human habitations. We looked at the Impala field camps as another. And we looked at temporary bomas where the Maasai Turkana people would graze animals in this area and as others. And, we basically said, if Dictix are transferring habituation from people to predators, near people, they would not discriminate between a bird song playback and a jackal playback. And we found the exact opposite. Turns out only tolerant Dictix, those that were within half a kilometer of people, discriminated by looking significantly more after hearing a jackal playback than a bird song, foraging significantly less, and nose twitching significantly more, right? Exact opposite. No difference between these things with greater than half a kilometer away from people. So I think the take-home message from this, and I think the mechanism of this, is that they were freaked out, and these were like ceiling effects farther from people. We drive around in a Land Cruiser, find a Dictix pair, turn off the engine, glide to a stop, do the playback. But so everything, distances were all the same, but they were more freaked out by us being there farther away. So the take-home message from this is, ecotourists at more pristine places are probably likely to disturb animals and interfere with their risk assessment. And if risk assessment is important for managing, life in a rich community of predators, then that's probably a bad thing. So we probably should be happy zoning areas for ecotourism and being careful about where we allow people to interact with things. So I work at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, Bob talked about earlier. I scare things. We get great students there. So Maya Carrasco sort of started scaring deer, and we saw sort of the same sort of thing. We play back marmot alarm calls versus white-crowned sparrow songs because I'm interested in understanding the communication networks of marmots, and it turns out that deer listen to marmots. But we only could detect deer listening to marmots close to people versus far from people. So again, about a half kilometer distance was the annulus, if you will, that matters. And we've done this with other species, and it seems there's something about half kilometer, which is kind of weird. Now, not all species have habituation-like processes. So if we go to the chaparral area in California, where there's a lot of coastal chaparral, if anything, we find in areas with more humans, we see greater FIDs for bush tits and American goldfinches and Beckwith wrens and wren tits, and no significant differences for a bunch of other species in terms of their flight initiation distance. I actually pulled out some slides to make the talk shorter, but this is contiguous habitat. This is, there's a lot of it. We did another study at wetlands in California, and we found that there were big differences in areas where ecotourists could go to wetlands and ecotourists couldn't go to wetlands. So the wetland birds had to be tolerant if they were able to live on wetlands with people. But in this contiguous habitat, it turns out we didn't have the same sort of an effect. If anything, they sensitized. So there's some take homes from habituation-like processes. I think understanding these is a key to understanding how species will respond to humans and our stimuli. Not all species habituate. The contiguous habitat hypothesis, which emerged from this, needs to be tested. A lack of tolerance to us and our stimuli may enhance human impacts on wildlife. So dik-diks and mule deer seemingly are distracted by people in places where they're not accustomed to people. And the spatial scale of tolerance, I pulled out some other slides as well, can be stark. And it turns out we've shown on different sides of a fence, you can have differences in tolerance, or it can be gradual and occur over, over distance. And we did work around the Santa Monica Pier going towards Crazy Venice in LA versus Malibu. And as you go towards Crazy Venice, FID doesn't change. And as you go towards Malibu, where there are fewer and fewer people, the farther away you get from the pier, FID does change. So, we need to understand the spatial ecology of fear more. Prey have more than one predator. What happens when they lose some? So years ago, working in Australia, I developed this idea called the multi-predator hypothesis. And the idea is the presence of a single predator will maintain pleiotropic or otherwise linked or integrated anti-predator behavior. And it's emerged from a series of other hypotheses. It's an ultimate hypothesis about why we see persistence of anti-predator behavior when you remove predators. The basis of this is, if you think about an ungulate, you think about a mule deer. Mule deer, when they're babies, they're spotted and they're cryptic and they don't bounce around a lot when their mom leaves them. So if they were cryptic, but they bounced around like they had a brain worm, they wouldn't be living long. So, we see evidence of integrated systems of anti-predator behavior. In this case, behavioral and morphological. Similarly, you could be really good at getting away from coyotes, but if you're really bad at getting away from eagles, you might have a problem. So we expect, maybe, I predict, that these things will co-evolve. They'll be packaged together in some way. The traits, whatever genetic basis is, they might be encoded in the same genes and not assort independently, for example. Regardless, we expect syndromes. So I think we expect anti-predator behavior to be linked and for selection to maintain these linkages as long as there's any benefit from doing so. In other words, as long as there's some predators. So going to Australia, it turns out, is a great place to begin asking these questions by looking at Tammar wallabies, which are small macropodid marsupials, and in some cases kangaroos. Tammars, at least, used to live on a wide swath of southern and southwestern Australia, but went extinct everywhere following the introduction of foxes and cats by Europeans. They persisted in one place in the mainland, in the wheat belt of Western Australia, a place called Tutanning Nature Reserve. So they had a rich exposure to mammalian predators. I'm focusing on mammalian predators here, but they have other predators too. They have large lizards here. They have snakes and raptors and whatever. Garden Island is the submarine base in Western Australia. Somehow they gave us permission to work there. They said, "Oh yeah, turn off you have to have a radio, but turn it and phone, but turn it off when you get close to the bunkers. That's where the weapons are stored. We don't want the bunkers going on." They let us walk around all night long. Submariners are insane. When they get off the boats, they drink and drive and make lots of noise. So we're out all night long, and this place was covered with poisonous snakes. So you have to look where you step. So we were at risk of predation as well, by lots of things. There also were two sizes of boas there. It's an amazing place. There were small boas, and then there were wallaby-eating boas, and there was like nothing in between. Extraordinary place. My wife and I were working together at the time, and I leave her the first night we're out there. I come back, she hadn't moved, and she's looking down at her feet. I'm like, "How'd it go?" She's like, "I haven't moved. There's too many snakes." But we got some data there. Kangaroo Island is a place where people went extinct. Mammalian predators went extinct as well. No mammalian predators, couple raptors, couple snakes, but probably not, no boas. And then the governor, years and years before, about 130 years before we did this work, took animals from mainland South Australia and introduced them to New Zealand because he wanted some mammals there. New Zealand, of course, is a place with no marsupials, right? So all the marsupials there were introduced and were pests. So we looked at TAMRs, and I'm focusing on mammalian behavior because I'm looking at anti-predator vigilance. This is all at night or near night or at night. And I'm looking at group size effects. And, snake predation is a bummer. You step on a landmine, you can't really do anything about that, really. But you can be vigilant and look for, a mammalian predator. Avian predators sort of strike like lightning. When I've seen marmots get killed by eagles, I was as scared as the marmots were and surprised because they just come down like a lightning bolt. But mammals you can do something with. So in LA, I sort of teach my students that, there's a probability of being killed by a predator if you're surfing alone. And, while more people are killed by falling coconuts and falling Coke machines than sharks, nonetheless, if you surf alone, you have some risk of predation. If you dilute that risk by surfing with someone else, you've halved it. 2 people, you've made it a third, et cetera. So the risk of predation goes down as you surf with more and more people, and the surfing doesn't get any better either. But at the end of the day, if animals are translating that risk to that decline in risk, then they should be less vigilant. Of course, when you're surfing with that many people, you have to be more vigilant because, but nonetheless, we expect what are called group size effects, where vigilance decreases with increasing group size. So we looked at this in TAMRs at these 4 places, and we found that isolation from all predators, New Zealand, because there were no predators, that was truly nirvana for TAMRs, eliminates group size effects. But at Kangaroo Island, where there were no mammalian predators, but there were avian predators and snakes to some extent, it increased. There were group size effects. I'm sorry, decreased. This is vigilance, that's foraging. Garden Island, where there were snakes and some raptors, but not really a lot of raptors, and certainly no mammalian predators. We saw group size effects, and we saw group size effects at Tataning, the place with everything. Take-home message is, I think this is a testable hypothesis, and turns out there's more studies out there to support it, and it may be the loss of all, not some predators that may increase a species vulnerability over time, and that studying predator cue discrimination, how animals detect and respond to predators, is sort of important to do, and understanding the history of exposure to predators is an important way to get traction on that. So Alex Carthy, a postdoc at the time at Macquarie, came and visited me at UCLA, and we start sketching things on boards because she's been doing this sort of work as well with olfactory predator recognition, and I've done the olfactory predator recognition stuff. And she's, we're writing down all the names of the hypotheses out there, and then she sort of runs silent, runs deep for a few days, and comes back with like what looked like a subway map. She's an incredibly good designer in addition to being super smart, and this ultimately is the final manifestation of our subway map. And our insight was we need to be thinking about ecological and evolutionary experience. And our goal here is to predict how well animals are going to fare when they encounter predators in the future, which is a problem we're facing now when we're trying to introduce animals into the wild, or when a new animal comes and changes its range and goes into a historic range where they weren't. So we can think about evolutionary and ecological experience with extant native predators. We can think about evolutionary experience only. We can think about no experience. We can think about ecological experience only. Ecological experiences, you're living with something now. Evolutionary experiences, you've lived with them for many generations. So then, we can start thinking about the timescales. We can think about what sort of experience, and we can think about mechanisms, which are all of these things that people had talked about in addition to the multi-predator hypothesis. That's just one mechanism to explain what happens when animals lose or gain predators. And then we can say, well, do they make a cue discrimination, or do they fail to make a cue discrimination? And then we sort of said, okay, well, let's go back to cue discrimination or not. Is the anti-predator response optimal? Is there no response? Is it inappropriate? Is it ineffective? Is it excessive? Because we see animals that know what predators are. Wolves are reintroduced to Colorado, right? They're going to come into my study site any day now. I know from studies that marmots know the sight, the sound, and the smell of wolves. I also know that marmots aren't going to fare well when the wolves get there because they're good predators. And we can think about the conservation prognosis. Very good, no experience needed. Very poor, too much experience needed. And then, ways to go in between them. So that stimulates a whole bunch of other work that I and others have been doing. And Australia is a great place to do this sort of work because Australia is a nightmare for recent mammalian extinctions. 38 native mammals, including marsupials and native rats and mice, have gone extinct since European settlement in 1788. 52 mammals are classified either as critically endangered or endangered. It is really sad. 33% of the mammals globally that have gone extinct have done so in Australia. I mean, we're having extinction debt, meaning that there are a lot more things about to go extinct than we recognize, but nonetheless, this is the front line for extinction for mammals. It's really depressing. Tasmania, however, is pretty cool. And Tasmania is where you can see some of these amazing mammals in ways that you can't in other parts of Australia. Feral foxes and cats, these are not your house cats, kill an estimated 75 million native animals each night, continentally. Feral cats kill between 169 and so they're big confidence intervals, and half a billion basically birds per year. And these are both native and introduced birds. So it's a huge problem. I and others have been developing ways to train animals about prey, and we've done this in captivity. We've shown with Tamar wallabies that not only can you increase their fear for foxes, but they can socially transmit that. That's Andrea Griffin's PhD work. My friend and colleague, Catherine Mosby, you might have read about her in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, cold emails me. She wasn't a friend and colleague at the time, and we got in a 1-month argument, which was super good. And she basically starts by saying, yeah, I tried this predator training stuff and it doesn't work. I'm like, oh, well, how'd you do it? Oh, I shot rubber bands at them. Maybe they don't like rubber bands. Maybe that wasn't effective. No, it doesn't work. She has strong opinions. She's also the most creative conservation scientist I know. She says, I think you just have to throw the predators in with the animals and let them sort it out. And I said, I think that's unethical. And then we argued for a month. And at the end of the month, she said, well, that was kind of fun. I go, yeah. I learned a lot. She goes, yeah, me too. She goes, we should do this. I'm writing a proposal. You want to be part of it? I'm like, yeah, I want to keep you honest. So, basically we did it. And the idea is what we call in situ predator training. So Mike Letnick of New South Wales joined us. And the idea is to expose animals to low densities of predators over long periods of time. And what I didn't realize is I'm thinking, oh yeah, we're going to put predators into an arena the size of the stage or the size of the room. But no, we put like 1 or 2 cats into an area, 32 hectares, and follow that over time. We're a bit agnostic about selection and evolution versus learning, although we're trying to make some inferences about that. Early on, I said we really should collect genomic samples and study this. And she's like, we can't collect anything else. We're doing too much already on our trap lines. And I trapped with them, and I'm like, yeah, we are doing a lot, but I really think the techniques are getting cheaper. We really should collect genomic samples. And this was over a decade ago. We should have collected genomic samples. In any event, we didn't. We're working at Arid Recovery in Roxby Downs, South Australia, in the arid zone in South Australia. Catherine and her husband, another super innovative conservation scientist, created this reserve and designed a cat-proof fence and a fox-proof fence. So it's a predator-proof fence. So it's 23 square kilometers of predator-proof fences divided into paddocks of different sizes, ranging from some that are 12 hectares to 30 some hectares, with cat-proof fences between them and predator-proof fences between them. Every once in a while, a predator comes in, they go figure out how to go shoot the predator or trap the predator out. So it's arid zone, and our cast of characters here included feral cats, burrowing bettongs, and greater bilbies. So this project, you could say, is we're trying to build better bilbies and bettongs. They're all nocturnal. I hate working at night. We were really concerned when we started this because we had control population and we had a manipulated population, and we start moving bettongs and bilbies in with, we couldn't get the last cat out of this one place where some cats had gotten in, and we wanted to start it with no cats because we thought maybe the cat will kill them all, because that happens. There are reintroductions that have happened. The animals are put in and one cat kills everyone in 2 nights. And we're like, oh my God, what's going to happen with this? We can't get this last cat out. Well, it turns out nothing happened, and the population increased rather dramatically. And we learned, over months that, beddongs can not only coexist with 2 cats, 4 cats, 3 cats, 5 cats, 10 cats, 12 cats, but their population can go up, and so can bilbies. So at the end of the day, the first thing we learned is there can be coexistence. The lesson from this is really an ecological lesson, that coexistence depends on other species as alternative prey. And we learned that after a 3-year drought where everybody died. And normally we go spotlighting, we would see all these mice. You can't see the mice anymore. All we saw were spiders, and that's when the beddongs were getting hit by the cats because they had nothing else to eat. We also followed a variety of behaviors, including flight initiation distance, which we figured out a way to do it at night because you can't see anything. And after, not immediately, after 12 months, still no significant difference. After 18 months, a year and a half, we started getting significant differences in flight initiation distances between our control and our treatment animals. We found that beddongs learned to discriminate cat models after living with cats, but they didn't discriminate cat models in the control enclosure. And then the goal was, well, what happens if we now take these trained and untrained animals, these animals that had, about 2 years of experience living with predators versus those that didn't, and put them into a common environment with cats. So we did that, and we could follow bilbies for about 40 days because we would have to tape. I mean, these are burrowing animals, so we had to tape transmitters on their tails, and after about 40 days, they kind of fell off. But what we found was bilbies that had experienced living with cats survived better than bilbies without experience with cats, significantly so. We did this with beddongs twice. High cat density before a drought, no difference. Low cat density after a drought, no difference in survival. And we could follow these longer because of the radios we had on them. So, we ultimately designed to do this in collaboration with a reserve where we were going to try to, the goal of this is to try to get animals living outside the fence and prospering, as opposed to large fence reserves, which is an increasingly important conservation strategy in Australia and New Zealand. How do we get them living outside the fence? So we had partners, but they never got their cat and fox populations down low enough that we felt it would be ethical to take our animals and put them out there. And then we lost most of our animals in a drought because it didn't rain for like 3 years. So then we sort of lost the ability to do that. Regardless, I think this is pretty promising that it shows that, that these species can coexist with predators in the right ecological context, and that living with predators can lead to increase a suite of behavioral changes, more than I talked about, but also can lead to increased survival when you put them in with real predators. So I talked about a lot. There's another marmot. And what are the take homes from this? I think we have to develop mechanistic models. I talked a lot about how animals, really process information at some level, and these sort of mechanistic models can predict how animals will respond to humans. I think we need to develop decision support tools when our goal is a conservation, addressing a conservation or management problem, so that managers will find it easier to use this information that they might not traditionally be using. I think we can use flight initiation distance to gain a lot of insights into how animals perceive risk. Not all animals increase their tolerance to human disturbance, and we have to develop a better understanding of what drives tolerance versus sensitization. I think cue discrimination mechanisms that I talked about in the latter part of the talk are really important, and that the multi-predator hypothesis is one of those that can explain, why animals can respond to predators and continue to respond to predators even after isolation. And isolation issues are an issue. When we bring animals into captivity, we take them away typically from all their predators. So that's a problem, because this can lead to the rapid decline and loss of anti-predator behavior. It occurred in at least 130 years or as much as 130 years in New Zealand. And I think that we may be able to inculcate fear into fearless populations, and that while this isn't appropriate for all species in all contexts, there are ethically appropriate contexts where this can be used. I think we need to use all the tools when appropriate to address the biodiversity crisis that we've created. And I think that all of these can be applied to solve conservation and management problems, but ultimately one needs to test them in an adaptive management framework. We need to test, we need to see if this is working. Is it? So, in medicine, the first thing is you compare things to a control. And then ideally we go the next step, and that gets FDA approval, right? But what you really want is comparative effectiveness evaluation. Do we need 6 drugs to, treat one thing? Is that just a waste of societal resources? So comparative effectiveness evaluation is sort of the next step in medicine, but also the next step in wildlife management. And with that, I've been playing with various AI tools, and this is supposed to be a burrowing bedong, but thank you for listening, and I'd be delighted to try to answer any questions you have. And thanks for coming out on a Monday night. You can take the seatbelts off now.
Yeah, questions for Dan? I think I may have to start us. Oh, okay, sorry.
Thanks, Dan. I'm just like the flip side of fear and vigilance is presumably a loss of like foraging opportunities. So have you also tried, or do you plan to incorporate kind of like climate change effects on food and foraging in your management models, since there could be trade-offs there?
Yeah, great question. The short answer is I'm not planning on doing that. But the flip side of that is, because it's costly to be afraid, sort of what are animals doing to perceive safety? So we know, so one lesson from this, I try to draw lots of lessons. I wrote this book called The Nature of Fear. And people say, so what's the main lesson? I go, you can't avoid risk, you have to manage it. And part of managing risk is not overreacting to threats. And part of not overreacting to threats is sort of knowing when to let go and go back out. So if you hide, you have loss of opportunities to forage. And we know that you can be perfectly safe. You can stay in your burrow, you can stay at home. A lot of us tried that during COVID. How did that go? Not so great, huh? So that's kind of bad and costly. So you got to go out. So you got to take some risks. So from an animal's perspective, what cues are they using to sort of go out? So the only animal behavior grant I've gotten from the NSF is working with Ari Martinez with mixed species flocks of Amazonian birds, looking at safety signals. So some colleagues and I did some models based on some studies that I and others have done, where safety cues or signals, where if you're scared, so what makes you scared and what makes you resume foraging after you've stopped foraging? This is why I'm coming to this from a foraging perspective. And if everyone around you stops moving, you should look around. When everyone around you is babbling away, maybe it's safer. So what is it that takes a room or a community of birds? And these mixed species flocks of Amazonian birds are perfect for this, because they really live in tight associations. And Ari's shown that there's all sorts of interesting alarm calls and alarm communication between species. But what is it that triggers the relaxation? So Seo Para, our brilliant graduate student, flew bicolored hawks, live bicolored hawks, through the forest and scared a bunch of mixed species flocks. And then we record everything. And the question, and we're still analyzing, it's taken a while, but we're very close. The question is, what signals changes in states? How many, what happens? Everyone's quiet, there's alarm calls, and there's no alarm calling. Then a couple of species start babbling, and then everyone starts babbling, and then you get back to the sort of babbling you had before. So I think that part of this is to understand safety and safety cues or safety signals. Is there an all clear signal? I'm not convinced yet. There is, there may be. But what are the cues that animals are using to infer safety? Now, why is that important? Because we've done this not only in intact Amazonian forest, but along an exploitation gradient where these mixed species flocks, which are highly evolved to work closely together, begin falling apart. So we're interested in the sort of human dimensions of how this whole system falls apart or doesn't fall apart in terms of getting back to what you were doing before, which is an important thing because you can't be afraid forever. So I'm sort of addressing that question from a behavioral way. I'm not doing the habitat modeling, but yeah, that could be important as well. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
So I guess that just made me think that bold individuals may be really important for that diffusion or whatever of the fear, but in really dangerous environments, they may not persist. So like, do you see those kinds of interactions?
I don't know. We don't know the
Okay.
individuals in these flocks. We're just recording everything and, annotating calls and trying to understand it from that. But yeah, bold. I mean, so why do we have personality variation along a shyness, boldness continuum in the first place? Well, being bold in a battlefield may not be a good thing, or it may be a good thing in some contexts, but typically not. Being bold at a bar may be a good thing, or not. But the point is that habitat matters, context matters, and one reason we may see variation in personality types is the payoffs differ, and that animals are exposed to differing trade-offs, and then in some places it's better to be bold and it's better to be shy, and that maintains variation at a population level. But you're right. It'll be very interesting to see if we know nothing about the individuals. The individuals aren't marked.
Yeah.
You could do it with chickadees.
Oh.
I mean, winter flocks of chickadees.
I have a special aversion to chickadees, but only because of how stuck they get in mist nets.
Okay, whoa. Oh, shouldn't be running.
I've actually got 3 questions, so I hope that's okay.
Sure.
So notably, Australia has a pretty bad history with putting up fences to keep things out, because you had the dingo fence that just didn't work, and then the rabbit fence that also didn't work.
Well, the dingo fence does work, and Mike Letnick's work has shown it works because he studied plots on either side of the fence, and it does work. The problem is dingoes eat cats. So actually where dingoes are, some animals have been able to coexist because the dingoes keep the cat population down. So dingoes are an ecological hero, not an ecological peril.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, like, what's the difference between kind of how those were set up? Is it just like the scope? Because the rabbit fence pretty much spanned the entire country, and the
dingo
cat
fence is greater than the Great Wall of China.
Yeah, versus the cat fences, which are smaller square kilometers and multiple of them versus one just like big fence.
Well, I mean, agriculture drove the dingo and the rabbit fences, and conservation's driving, predator havens and predator-free fencing for smaller populations and areas. The challenge is you fence everything and keep the predators out, and then the animals overeat the ground and they overeat the vegetation, and then have so you need to rebuild communities and put those in, and Catherine's doing interesting work on that as well, and other people are thinking about it as well. Catherine was years ahead of thinking about that particular problem. But I think, sadly, fencing is going to be an important conservation strategy in some places like Australia or like New Zealand. Now, we can talk after over drinks, about compassionate conservation. I believe this is compassionate conservation, even though I'm responsible for killing cats and foxes at times. Because we're trying to create ways for these animals to coexist. True compassionate conservationists would say, no, this is the new environment. Whatever exists, because cats have the same rights as endemic species. For me, I value endemism more, and that's why I think I'm a compassionate conservationist, but people would call me a cat killer. So there we have it.
Yeah, actually kind of relating to that, my next question was about like human hunting as conservation, because in Australia for a while there were bounties out for like feral pigs, feral cats, foxes. Not as much anymore, but there's kind of like still an open hunting season. So is that effective? Is it worth it? Or do you, lose more animals by people shooting the wrong thing?
No, the shooters are really good. We hire, in the past, we hired a cat shooter. Um, uh, and they're really good. I mean, it's really hard to kill these cats. Catherine and her husband are Dr. Evil, and they've created something called the Felixer. So you can put out baits on a continental scale and kill foxes, but the cats don't take the bait. So the Felixer goes after how cats view the world. And it's sort of a game camera that has an AI engine that recognizes it's a cat, and then it spurts out a glob of poison that sticks to their fur, and then they groom it off and die. The Felixer. I mean, that's definitely Dr. Evil realm. Brilliant, actually. But putting that on a continental scale isn't really going to work either. So either we give up, which is what true compassionate conservationists would argue, or I would say the extreme compassionate conservationists would argue. We have a mix of places where we can reduce cat and fox populations and densities, at least during some times, and can probably get coexistence. And we can try to build better badongs and bilbies. Again, bilbies kind of worked, badongs didn't. Badongs are much more social, and maybe they're much more attractive to cats, whereas bilbies are individualistic and more solitary. So maybe they get better, but they aren't an attractor for the cats in the same way.
Yeah, the context on that is that I know somebody who works on a cattle station, a sheep station, just out in the middle of the bush. And part of protecting the herd and the flock is getting rid of predators because they are, agricultural, not, wild herds. And it's not as much of a conservation lens, but, she's works in agriculture. So
well,
the
the scale in Australian agriculture, I mean, look, they should not be running sheep and cows. They should be running kangaroos, and we should be eating kangaroo, which is good and ecological. And, you put some water holes out, and then you figure out a way to manage kangaroos for a crop. But people don't like that because they're always pregnant. There's always a Joey. And that's a problem. And there's also a stigma of if you're poor, maybe you ate kangaroo, but it can be prepared really well. But, these sheep stations and cattle stations, particularly cattle stations, are ginormous. I mean, one was, bigger than the state of Texas. They're running not large herds over a large area with not a lot of food. And, one or two mortalities can really tilt the economics of it. It's not economical to go out and defend animals as it might be in other habitats in arid zone Australia. Other parts of Australia it might be. So you have to think about the economic situation as well, which is, why they put up the dingo fence.
Yeah. And then last question, I'll let somebody else have a turn. So one of kind of the broad themes that you see in like animal behavior textbooks, and I'm taking that class right now, is not putting anthropomorphic behavior ideas onto animals. So how do you balance that with the cognition hypothesis? Is it just not assigning human traits to animals, or can you kind of, not pick and choose, but how do you kind of balance that?
I think there's bad anthropomorphism, there's good anthropomorphism, but once you sort of acknowledge the Umwelt, that animals have their own perceptual worlds, it's really a challenge to figure out how they perceive the world. And ideally, we're going to design realistic experiments or come up with realistic decision support tools by understanding the abilities that they have evolved, which is not an anthropomorphic approach. We need to understand the abilities that animals have evolved. Bad anthropomorphism is good for Disney films, but understanding that animals have emotional lives, that's not anthropomorphism, that's a hypothesis. What does that look like? So I could have given a talk about The Sound of Fear, and that whole story was a trajectory from being surprised that I was having an emotional response to hearing a baby marmot calling, to understanding how and why certain music and soundtracks are created the way they are. And, that's not anthropomorphism. I don't know animals that have Schadenfreude, so I'm not saying that animals have all emotions that we have. Humans are unique in many ways. Language is unique in many ways. But they do have some emotions. And, assuming they don't, and animals are just autonoma, I think is a sort of a silly way to approach things. And the question is, well, what evidence would you want to support a particular hypothesis? And again, make it a scientific argument rather than a, animals are stupid and don't respond to anything. I mean, part of the reason I've been working in Australia so much is because I went there and everyone's like, oh yeah, these animals are stupid. They don't know what predators are. I'm like, they kind of do know what predators are. They kind of can learn what predators are, but they're not faring well. So maybe it's an ecological problem. Oh, they don't understand what predators are. They're stupid. Well, they're not. And if you ask them the right questions, you see what they're evolved to do and what they're not evolved to do. And that is, sort of, I mean, I think the evolution of cognitive abilities is a super interesting, area to think about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I think, whoops, maybe what have we got? One more. All right, one more here, and I'm going to let everybody.
One more, and I need a beer.
Give Dan a rest.
Hi. So you talked about how bilbies versus betongs, whatever, are social versus more solitary. So how would that be applied to other potential prey species, or is that just?
No, that's what I mean. It's we don't have a control. We just have two species, and they do other things as well. So that's a hypothesis that needs to be evaluated. But bilbies, all these macropodids, bilbies aren't macropodids, but the macropodids all thump their feet when they detect a predator. That's basically saying, thump, I see you. And they sort of sit there, and the tamers would sort of sit there and give a tamer look. And that's probably not that effective against predators. So if that's their anti-predator behavior, they know what a predator is, thump, go away, and you don't go away. That's a mismatch. So that could be what's going on. Betongs don't do that, but maybe there's a solitary social thing as well. Betongs also make farting sounds all night long, and they can be in big aggregations. So it's really easy to find the betongs. It's harder to find more solitary bilbies. And all of these have burrows, but they use different burrows. So at some level, predators could just stake out every burrow and learn every burrow. But I don't know, maybe it's sociality, maybe it's something else. We need to study that. Someone needs to study that.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
All right, yes, thank you.